song that has something to do with the sermon, but as you can see based on my first slide here, there aren't a whole lot of songs about cars in our hymn books, but that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. If you will, open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 8. We'll be looking at that passage for this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 8. The picture I have up here on the screen is of a Tesla brand vehicle, the Model S. Some of you may have heard of Tesla. Roger's giving me a big thumbs up, okay? Tesla's a somewhat new automobile company founded by Elon Musk. What if your last name was Musk? Y'all? That's about as bad as Missildine. But anyway, he has developed this line of cars, and the Model S is very unique because it includes some auto driving features. Now, when I say auto driving, that's what I mean, is automatic driving. It can actually drive itself down the road. It has all kind of sensors and computers on it that scan the road ahead, that sense traffic around it, and you can actually take your hands off the wheel and just let the car drive. Now, there have been some accidents, which has got some people concerned, as it would me, but apparently some people that own Tesla Model S's have gone so far as to fall asleep at the wheel. This was a screen cap from a video taken earlier this week of someone driving down the road, and they saw this driver in a Tesla Model S asleep at the wheel. And so they took some video of it, and it's making the rounds on social media. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it, who's actually driving? Now, on the commercials, they'll say that driver input is still needed and the driver must maintain control of the vehicle at all times, but apparently some people are ignoring that. And so we ask the question, well, who's driving? If I were to pull up on this vehicle on the side of the road and see somebody asleep at the wheel, I'd wonder that myself. Who's driving? Well, that's the question that I want us to look at this morning in our lives spiritually. Who's doing the driving? Who is driving? We want to look at 1 Samuel chapter 8. We're going to read sections of this as we go along this morning. We're going to start in verse 1 of 1 Samuel chapter 8. And y'all pardon me here, I have to put my eyeballs on. 1 Samuel chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn son's name was Joel, and his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned toward dishonest gain, took bribes, and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not follow your example. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand sinful, so he prayed to the Lord. Here we see that the children of Israel wanted to move God out of the driver's seat, if you will. They did not want God driving their vehicle anymore. We do the same thing spiritually. A lot of times in our lives, we want to move God out of the driver's seat and either take over for ourselves or just let the car do the driving on its own, as this fella is right here. But you know what? There's some problems with that. And this morning I want us to look at 3 reasons why we decide to move God out of the driver's seat, and then 3 responses that God has about that. Number 1, we move God out of the driver's seat because we've decided that God is simply out of time. You see, God didn't deal, at least in the children of Israel's mind, God didn't deal with Samuel's sons like they thought he should have. They didn't like the fact that they had turned wicked. They didn't like the fact that they were taking these bribes, that they weren't judging the way they're supposed to. And so they said, you know what? Give us a king like everyone else around us. They were tired of waiting on God. They wanted Joel, Abijah, and apparently Samuel out of office immediately. We get tired sometimes waiting on God to do something that we think we already have an answer to. Why should God make us wait? This is our thinking. Why should God make us wait when we can solve it now with our own brilliant plan? And we know how that goes oftentimes, don't we? So we just move him out of the driver's seat and we start going our own way. I think about several stories in the Bible about this. Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 6, where God had promised Abraham a son. And yet now he's getting old. He's getting close to 100. Sarah's getting close to 90. They still don't have a child. And so Sarah decides she's tired of waiting on God. So she moves God out of the driver's seat and she goes to Abraham and she says, "Here, take Hagar, my handmaiden. You go have a child with her, and this will be the child of promise." And of course, Abraham does that, and we know the results. Ishmael is born, and Sarah begins to treat Hagar badly, so much so that Hagar has to leave, and Abraham sends them away. And even to this day, the descendants of Abraham and Ishmael are at odds with one another. I think about Saul and the sacrifice in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 8 through 14. He's waiting on Samuel to make the sacrifice. Samuel was also the priest. He waited a week. Got tired of waiting. So he went ahead and made the sacrifice. As soon as he made it, guess what? Samuel shows up. And Samuel tells him, "Why have you done this abomination before God?" He did not have a right, Saul, to make that sacrifice. And because he made that sacrifice without permission, without being appointed to do so, Samuel told him on behalf of God, "Kingdom's taken away from you. You're not going to be king anymore." And in fact, it tells us that as Samuel turns away from Saul, Saul reaches out and grabs his garment and it rips. And Samuel turns around and looks and says, "God's ripped the kingdom from you." And of course, we know that then God appointed David, and we know what happened with that story. We could go on and look at other examples, but I think you get the idea. When we get tired of waiting on God, and we try to take matters into our own hands, and we try to do what we think is best, the passage in Proverbs comes to mind. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is the way of death. We think we know what's right. We think that we know better than God. But you know what? When God's driving, He knows the way. He knows where the potholes are. He knows where all the obstructions are. And we, on the other hand, do not. And so we need to be very careful if we're trying to move God out of the driver's seat. A second reason we move God out of the driver's seat is because we have decided that everyone else has it better than we do. It's the grass is always greener on the other side mentality. Look back down at the passage here. We want to look at verse 5 and then skip down to verses 19 and 20. Verse 5, they said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not follow your example. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." Now skip down to verse 19. After God's response, which we'll come back and look at in just a moment, the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we must have a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles." You see, the children of Israel here wanted to be like the other nations around them. And this problem goes all the way back to the time of Joshua and coming into the promised land and not eradicating those people like God had told them to. They left little pockets of them. They didn't utterly destroy them as God had told them to, and they became a thorn in Israel's side. And they got this mentality right here. They started looking at the nations around them and they said, "You know what? They're better than we are. They've got kings. They've got all these other things. We want to be like them." Well, guess what? Until you've lived in other people's shoes, you don't have a clue, do you? It seems like the grass might be greener on the other side. And it seems like we look around at people around us and it would, their lifestyle, the things that they have would seem to make my life easier. But that's not always the case, especially once we try it out. Maybe you think that having a better job that paid a lot more money would make your life easier because you could get whatever stuff you wanted, but you didn't realize there was a heavy price to pay for all the time it took you away from your family in order to make that money. Just maybe God didn't give us someone else's life on purpose. Have you ever thought about that? You see, when you move God out of the driver's seat so that you can go in the direction that was meant for someone else, you're going to hit a pothole. You're going to hit an obstruction. God has been preparing them to travel that path and know what to avoid, not necessarily you. One preacher told his story this way. When he went to college, he decided that he wanted to be a pharmacist. Why? Well, pharmacists make a lot more money than ministers. He had pushed God out of the driver's seat, and he said that the next several years of his life really didn't go so well for him. In fact, after realizing pharmacy school was going to be too hard, he changed his major and began pursuing a teaching degree. But after he had observed kindergarten, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, and 11th grade, he realized he didn't like any of those. So he called his dad up. He said, "Dad, I don't know what to do. I can't find any grade that I like." And his dad said, "Son, maybe that's not what you're supposed to be doing." You see, we need to stop looking at the other side of the fence. We need to stop thinking that the grass is greener on the other side and let God mold us and make us into the person that He wants us to be. Let God stay in the driver's seat. The third reason, though, that we move God out of the driver's seat is because we have decided we want someone to do our part for us. Again, look at verses 19 and 20 once again. Notice especially the last part of verse 20. The people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, "We must have a king over us. Then we'll be like all the other nations. Our king will judge us. Go out before us," and note, "and fight our battles." They didn't really want a king to lead them. They wanted a king to go and fight their battles for them. They didn't want someone to tell them what they were supposed to be doing. They wanted a puppet. They wanted someone who they could tell what to do. Up until this point, the people had to go and fight their own battles. They had to raise their own armies, and they had gone out under the leadership of some of their judges, yes, but they had to go and fight these battles. They wanted a king that would go do that for them. We have a word for that. It's called laziness. If you move God out of the driver's seat so that someone else can drive, watch out. I guarantee you that'll be like letting a blind person drive your car down the interstate with you in the passenger seat. It might not end up so well. But that's what we do. We push God out of the driver's seat because we think we know better. Well, what's God's response to all of this? Well, we have it right here in this passage. Let's go back to verse 6 to begin with. When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand sinful. So he prayed to the Lord, but the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me, since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but you must solemnly warn them and tell them about the rights of the king who will rule over them." God knew that they were rejecting him as king, but this wasn't the first time they had done that. When we ask God to scoot over there so we can drive, how does he respond? When we try to take God out of the driver's seat, what does he say to us? Well, he says the same thing that he said to the children of Israel here. 3 things, and then we'll close. Number 1, would you believe it or not, God listens to us. He listens when we tell him to move over. Look again down at the passage there. Verse 7, the Lord told him, Samuel, "Listen to them." Then again in verse 9, "Listen to them." God listens to us. He heard their cries. He told Samuel to listen to them. I believe with all my heart that God truly does care about our concerns and our worries, and he does listen to us. The children of Israel here, God was listening to them. Now, it wasn't what he wanted to hear. He didn't want them to refuse him as their king, which is what they were doing. That's what he says right there. He tells Samuel, they're not refusing you, they're refusing me. They already had a king, me, but they're refusing me. But God listened to them. But then secondly, God responds by warning. Look down again at beginning in verse 10. Samuel told all the Lord's words to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These are the rights of the king who will rule over you. He can take your sons and put them to his use in chariots, on his horses, or running in front of his chariots. He can appoint them for his use as commanders of thousands or commanders of 50s, to plow his ground or reap his harvest, to make his weapons of war or the equipment for his chariots. He can take your daughters to become perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He can take your best fields, vineyards, and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He can take 1/10 of your grain in your vineyards and give them to his officials and servants. He can take your male servants, your female servants, your best young men, and your donkeys and use them for his work. He can take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves can become his servants. When that day comes, you will cry out because of the king you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord won't answer you on that day. That's a pretty stern warning. God's telling them, okay, you want a king? Here's what's going to happen if you get a king. He warned them. He's going to be able to do all these things. And most of it consisted of the king being able to take from the people their children, their flocks, their fields, themselves. God said, are you sure you really want this? He was warning them. God wanted them to understand there were some things they had not considered. You see, we did the same thing. The children of Israel looked around them, they saw the nations around them, and they were only concentrating on the positive, or what they thought was the positive aspects of having a king. We do the same thing. We only look at the positive things. We gloss over those negative things. We tend to kind of push them to the side and pretend they don't exist, and we only look at what the good or the benefit will be, or the perceived benefit for us. But God warned them. And God will warn us when we're about to make a bad decision. Now, you may say, well, he doesn't warn me. If you think that, you're wrong, because guess what? His word warns us of many, many things. And so if we choose not to study the Bible and not to live by it, then that's our decision. But God has given us an escape. He's given us a warning right here about these things that we want when we try to move him out of the driver's seat. Thirdly and finally, God responds by letting us have what we want. God gives it to us. Again, look down at the passage, the last two verses, beginning in verse 21. The people said, no, we want a king. Samuel listened to all the people's words and then repeated them to the Lord. Listen to them, the Lord told Samuel. Appoint a king for them. Then Samuel told the men of Israel, each of you go back to your city. God tried to warn them. God tried to say, no, I'm your king. But if you want a king, here's what's going to happen. That didn't deter them. They said, yes, we want a king. Give us a king. And so God said, okay, here you go. You've probably heard the phrase before, be careful what you wish for. You may get it. That's exactly what happened right here. The children of Israel wanted a king. Well, God gave them a king, and we see what happened. The very first king that was appointed for them, Saul, didn't turn out so well. The second king, David, he was a much better man, but still, he had his faults, as we've been talking about in Bible class. And then the third king, Solomon, he was okay. He did a lot of bad things, though. He took a lot of things from the people. And then when he passed, the kingdom was divided. It was torn in two. And trouble continued to ensue for the children of Israel. If we say that we want God to move out of the driver's seat, God may say, okay, here you go. I'm giving you what you asked for. And most all of the time, it does not turn out the way that we thought it would. So in conclusion, I ask you this morning, who's in the driver's seat in your life? If you've been driving down the road and you're tired of hitting all the potholes, you're tired of hitting all those obstacles, maybe it's time for you to get out of the driver's seat and let God drive. There was a book that was written after World War II, and you've seen the bumper sticker a lot, you know, God is my co-pilot. And I get it, I understand it. That pilot was saying that God was with him and all that. But then the bumper stickers come out, if God is your co-pilot, switch seats. God needs to be in control. He needs to be in charge. He needs to be the one driving. He needs to be the one flying. Move over and let God drive. You're going to have to decide today who's going to drive you through life. Is it going to be you? We know how that's going to turn out. Or is it going to be God? Make the right decision. Let God be in control. Move out of His way and let Him lead your life. This morning, if you need to become a Christian, you've done that in the past that have wandered away and need to make things right, whatever your need would be, we invite you to come and respond as together we stand and sing. For the